I'd like to talk a little bit about the Passover Seder. One of the reasons I do this is because as a parent, I always felt so much anxiety about it, um, because I always thought I was doing the wrong thing. And I think that's a thing that parents commonly feel or do, that they're looking at somebody else and thinking, well, they really know how to do it and I don't. And I think the first thing about the Passover Seder that's really, really important to remember is that the fact that you're sitting down with your family or your friends or whatever and telling this story means you're placing yourself in relationship to a tradition that has gone on for centuries and centuries. And the very sitting down is really a fulfillment of what happens on Passover. And what happens on Passover is primarily this moment of teaching. One of the things that's interesting about the Passover Seder is that much of the Haggadah, which is like a gadot, a drush, a set of interpretations on the Passover and the events of Yetziat Mitzrayim, well, even that is a little bit complicated. The Seder really consists of instructions on how to make a Seder, who should do it, what's entailed by doing it, when you do it, where you do it, what you eat at it. It's a strange ritual, which on the one hand, again, is this aspect of remembrance, but the remembrance is it's not only the Exodus from Egypt. I think more, it's the memory of telling this story or being part of this story that for generations we've been telling. And sitting down at the table, that itself enacts the story. Our telling the story is an expression of freedom. We are placing ourselves in relationship to this story of freedom. The Passover Seder the Haggadah has been really impoverished in its subordination to other stories, whatever those stories are. And it's great that people find inspiration from the Haggadah. And they are right in a way, people who turn Passover into a social justice program. They are right in a way to look at the Haggadah as the source for that. And that really, when the Jews leave Mitzrayim and they accept their status or understand their status as a chosen people, this is the moment of freedom not only for Jews, it is the moment of freedom for all of human history. This choosing to get out of the limitations that are placed upon us all of the time by our circumstances. That's what Egypt is, circumstances. Overbearing, overriding circumstances. And the Jews follow this call to freedom. And in that moment of relationship with the divine, there is the moment of choice and the moment of freedom. It's the paradox, right? And the poet John Milton gets this paradox as well. God is the author of all things, and in Paradise Lost, Adam and Eve are authors to themselves. The two go together. And the Jews really accept, in a way, the Passover Seder is much more important than the Exodus. There's a verse in the Torah which gets repeated in the Haggadah, Ba'avor zeh, on account of this, you took us out of Egypt. And Rashi, the medieval commentator on the Chumash, says, on account of this, in order that I can do mitzvot. Klomar, matzah, for example, matzah, moror, v'korban pesach. God took us out of Egypt. Why? Why did he take us out of Egypt? So we could be sitting at this table performing the mitzvah. The mitzvah itself, and the mitzvah is sitting, telling the story of freedom. And the exodus from Egypt is subordinate to that moment. At a certain point in the Haggadah, you'll remember it, it's after the discussion of what time to say Kriyat Shema after the sages are learning all night. And it says, Baruch HaMakom, blessed is the place. So it does come as a kind of shock to the system. We've been involved in all this halachic discussion, and then the Haggadah says, remember, God's here. Baruch HaMakom is Blessed is God, and the name of God here is strange, God as place. And the Haggadah is telling us the place, God as place. It's not only among those 5 sages who are sitting in Bnei Brak, it's here. It's this place, this world, this table. This is the place. God is present here. What we do, it's sometimes we lose the power of the Haggadah because we get involved or too scared about all the details, or in some contexts we get so involved in the issues of learning. And what I mean by learning is in a kind of expansiveness that is exclusive of experience. That is addressed, in fact, by the Haggadah in the discussion of the wise son. And the wise son says, of course, the 4 sons, and the 4 sons are non-existent. They are abstractions. Aristotle, when he talks about form and matter, which are opposites, right? He talks about them as abstractions. Not in their extreme, they do not exist. They only exist in relationship to each other. Tell this, right? And the same thing maintains with the 4 sons. They are children. They are all abstractions, and and we are learning in relationship to the 4 children that we must tell the story for the people who are there. And if we stay in this realm of very high level halachic discussion, legal discussion, that's fine for some people. We're going to miss the experience. And that's what the answer to the wise son is. He says, just like the Rasha, just like the evil child says, what does this mean to you? The wise son also says, well, tell me, what is this all about to you? His language is much more positive. He's interested in the Seder. But the father says, go learn halacha. And in a way, I think it's a kind of put down, meaning you're really not ready for the Seder, because the Seder, and this is really what I want to emphasize, the Seder is about the experience. It's about, and the experience, one is this experience of storytelling, and the experience is entirely mediated through food. Let's look at one passage from the Haggadah. The 4 questions. There's also something odd about the 4 questions, that the children, everybody knows the answer to these questions, right? Everybody knows. The children know. They've been practicing. So it really, the 4 questions is, Abba, Ima, parents, tell us the story again. Tell us the story again. We want to hear. That's this beautiful moment, this pedagogical moment. And then the Seder leaders or whatever, they tell the story to the children, but the story itself, we know the story, the activity. And we say, there's a discussion among lots of people. What is the difference between saying the Shema at nighttime or every day and what we do on Pesach? This is actually comes out of the discussion of in the Seder of the 5 sages. They're sitting up all night and they're telling the story of Pesach, and then their Talmidim, their students come and say, it's time to say Kriyat Shema. It's time to say the Shema. A lot of things interesting about the story. One thing is, what is the relationship between saying, we remember the Passover every night. We remember the Exodus every night. What is distinctive about Pesach? There's a difference between to remember and to tell, Sipur. And the story, and the Sipur is, there's somebody else there. This is an activity. It's an activity of teaching. And again, not only teaching the story, but teaching the idea of telling the story. And every place we look in the Haggadah, we see this emphasis on storytelling. There's a machloket, there's a dispute in the Gemara about where do we start when we tell this story, or really what is the nature of the story. And both perspectives, Rav and Shmuel, are reflected in the Haggadah. Let's look at this passage. Avadim hayinu, we were slaves to Paro in Egypt. So Rav says we begin with the fact that we were slaves, and we end with our redemption. And the Haggadah really kind of works with Rav. If the Holy One, blessed be He, had not brought our ancestors, Esau Hoseinu Mitzrayim, Hari Anu, Uvanenu, All of us, our children and our children's children, would still be enslaved. Okay, so they would still be enslaved. Now, if you start to get into geopolitical discussions here, you're missing the point. This is to emphasize our children, your children, the children of the monotheistic religions, we would all be slaves. We would all be idolaters. What does that mean to be an idolater? It's not just to be like an old bad person. It means to never get out of conventional thinking. It means to never break out of circumstance. It means to never choose for oneself. We would still be there. And not only we would have been assimilated to the world of idolatry, assimilated to that world of circumstances. And here's a crucial part. Even if we were all wise, all insightful, nevonim, zakenim, all elders, we know everything, so we know right away. It's not a question just of knowing. Mitzvah aleinu l'saper b'yitzias Mitzrayim. It is a mitzvah upon us. Blessed are the Jews for whom telling a story is a mitzvah. L'saper b'yitzias Mitzrayim. V'chol hamarbe l'saper b'yitzias Mitzrayim harizeh mishubach. And anyone who is increasing, who adds to the story, l'saper b'yitzias Mitzrayim harizeh mishubach. Lots, and the Haggadah, like many Jewish sacred texts, just explodes and is open to so many different interpretations. I think here, the story, Harizeh Mishubach, however we personalize the story, however we talk to the people at our table, Harizeh Mishubach, it's not just coming up with, interpretations that nobody's heard before. Maybe that is for some tables, but it's finding a way to talk to the people at your table, whatever that is. I would also say, and this is very important from a parenting perspective, and I've been there, is it doesn't matter if your kids listen or don't listen, as long as they're in the same room, really, as long as they're in the same room, that's what matters. That's it. I say this out of personal experience, feeling incredible anxiety about my children not being present, right? They're not there. Or they're not participating. And today they all make their own seders. They all sit at the table. The grandkids come and they say, tell the story again. So part of that is, I decided when I was doing this, I'm giving the impression of myself as hapless, and I wasn't. I was trying hard. And one of the things that I did just for my kids, and I know I don't mean this to sound hokey, and different people should do different versions of this, but for my family, like doing little things like having frogs here, that was kind of cool for the 10 plagues. And I would buy red dye #2 every year. Now I use wine because I'm too lazy to go to the supermarket to find it. And you pour a little bit in the bottom of a cup and then you pour water into it and then everything turns red, right? And it does sound kind of hokey, but not only my kids loved it, but now my grandkids, are waiting for that and for the marshmallows that I throw for the hail. And I'm saying this not to say, oh, look how cool a parent I am, although I am taking pride in the fact that my kids sit at the Seder now. And I think part of that has something to do with it. But to find out, what do your kids need to be engaged? Do they draw pictures? Whatever it is, what works for your children, or what works for your guests, to bring them in and make them engage. And that really just comes to the last point. So much of the Pesach Seder is really experiential. And when we have this idea of Sipur Yitzis Mitzrayim, there is the idea of speaking and telling a story, even apparently if it's to oneself. And I think also we say it doesn't matter if we know it well. We tell the story again because of the experience. And the experience of telling the story all centers around the food. Lechem ani, halachmani'ah, the poor bread that starts in a kind of poverty, then the moral, the bitterness, then the charoset, the cement used to build the pyramids. Throughout all of this, food has connotations of slavery, of oppression. The matzah also, the haste, and yet, right, all of these are parts of the Seder, and it's a good thing if you are running a Seder just to get a book like this one in Hebrew, Haggadah, it just has good, or get it in English, right? Just the instructions, because the choreography is hard, right? But amidst all of this food with connotations of slavery, there are also the arbakos of the wine. And the wine cups are our standing up and really praising God. It's a weird thing, right? We're standing up and praising God. Why are we praising God? Because we're sitting at this table. And that's all we want, right? We're praising God for not being in Egypt, but we're praising God for sitting at this table telling the story. Telling the story. The Seder itself, the one part of the Seder which is not instructions on how to make a Seder, is a portion from Deuteronomy, where a farmer comes and brings his first fruits to the Kohen, to the priest, and says, I remember when we were slaves in Egypt, and now I am here. So the one place, the Haggadah, the drashot of verses in the Torah, is about somebody remembering. And then every part of the 4 or 5 verses that are brought from that guy who stands in front of the Kohen and says, I remember, that's from Deuteronomy. And then every part of it is parsed, and a quote is brought from Exodus, right? Deuteronomy is Mishnah Torah. It's the repetition of the Torah. It's the second time. It's the time of remembrance, of repetition. So the verses that we interpret then bring back as their source. They themselves are remembering what happened in Exodus, in the earlier book in the Torah. So it's our ceremony of remembrance, a drasha, a set of interpretations of somebody else remembering. And then the Torah itself, or the Haggadah itself, remembering that this story of the guy who shows up in front of the high priest at the time of the temple is itself going back to Exodus. We are a people who remembers. We are a people who remembers, and this is the courage of the Jewish people, and this is the importance of the Seder, a part of it. We have the courage to remember the really bad times. And the Haggadah is mixed, right? Because the redemption from Egypt, it anticipates, and it's always implicit, the future redemption is kind of under the surface, but it's not explicit. So we're still living in time. Hashana haba, this year we are here, next year Hashana haba b'Yushalayim. That just doesn't mean we're all going to get on El Al flights and go to the tarmac and kiss the ground. Hashana haba b'Yushalayim means we will experience a kind of mental freedom, a kind of freedom from the circumstances that weigh us down. As I was saying, we Jews we remember even in the bad, and we don't give up. And that's the mitzvah of Yetzias Mitzrayim. We are telling the story. We told the story when the Romans were killing us, when the first and second temples were destroyed. We told the story during the Shoah and concentration camps. We told the story in Russia. We tell the story. And that is the expression of our freedom, placing ourselves in relationship to this history where we chose, despite our circumstances, we chose the burdensome and terrible, but on Pesach, the celebratory thing about being a Jew, we chose to be chosen. We chose to choose. Have fun at your Seder. Don't let people ruin it by, be like a nasty seminar leader. If somebody goes on and on, cut them off. It's for the children or the children among us inside of us, right? It's not only for the wise son who wants to impress us. It's about the experience. Yalla.